Ever wonder, like, how can something as complex as life, with all its intricate parts, just appear in a universe that seems to love disorder?
It's a question that's puzzled scientists and philosophers for centuries.
And today, we're tackling that mind-boggling question, and we've got a heck of a guide for this deep dive. Erwin Schrödinger and his 1944 book, What is Life?
Yeah, it's a fascinating read, especially given Schrodinger's background.
Right. This is the guy who helped lay the foundations of quantum mechanics. He's exploring the mysteries of living
It's
organisms.
like he's saying, hey, I'm a physics guy, but even I can't ignore how wild life is.
Totally. So he dives in, tries to see if physics and chemistry alone can explain a living being.
And what he finds is, well, the answer is more complicated than you might think.
Okay, so to kick things off, Schrödinger introduces us to this idea of a naive physicist.
Right, imagine you're a physicist, spent your life studying the laws of the universe,
You think you've got a grip on how things work.
and bam, you encounter a living cell.
All of a sudden, those laws seem a little shaky, right?
Exactly. And Schrödinger uses this naive physicist to highlight just how different the world of atoms is from the world of, well, us.
And his starting point is a doozy. He asks, why are atoms so small?
It seems like a weirdly basic question, I know. You'd think he'd jump right into DNA or something.
Yeah, why start there?
Well, Schrödinger used this question to point out the huge difference in scale between, like, the tiniest bits of matter and the intricate structures they create in living things.
So it's like asking, how can something as organized as a human being come from something as chaotic as a bunch of atoms?
Precisely. And this is where Schrödinger's background in physics, especially statistical physics, comes into play.
Statistical physics, now we're getting to the good stuff. Okay, so for our listeners who might not be physicists, what's the connection?
Well, statistical physics basically says that the laws we see in the world around us, they often come from the behavior of huge numbers of particles.
Okay, I think I'm following. It's like the difference between trying to track a single raindrop in a storm versus understanding how weather patterns work, right?
Exactly, you've got it.
Hmm.
We can't predict where that single raindrop will land, but we can see the overall movement of the storm.
So Schrodinger's saying that even though individual atoms might be bouncing around like crazy, their collective behavior can create order.
Right. It's about looking at the bigger picture. And this is how he starts to tackle that big question.
Mm.
How can something as organized and seemingly improbable as life arise from something as seemingly random and chaotic as a bunch of atoms? He's suggesting that maybe, just maybe, there are hidden laws, precise physical laws, governing the way those atoms come together to create life.
Okay, so we're starting to see how a physicist's brain approaches the mystery of life. But how do we go from these tiny atoms to something as complex as, say, a human being? We've got to be talking about more than just a bunch of particles bumping into each other, right?
Absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting. To understand how life arises from non-life, Schrödinger says we need to consider not just the laws of physics, but also the very nature of information itself.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Information, huh? We're talking about the blueprints of life, the instructions that tell those atoms how to arrange themselves.
Exactly. And those blueprints, those instructions, are what we're going to unpack next.
Blueprints of life, instructions for atoms. Okay, now we're talking. So how do these instructions, actually work? Where are they stored?
Well, that's where things get really mind-blowing. Schrödinger, he was just captivated by this whole question of heredity. And he zeroes in on these things, these tiny structures called chromosomes.
Chromosomes, right, right. Those X-shaped things we learned about in biology class are like, oh, the instruction manuals, right, for an entire organism.
More like microscopic code scripts. They hold the blueprint, the whole plan for building a whole organism from just a single cell, a fertilized egg.
Yeah.
And Schrödinger, he marveled at how these chromosomes, how they carry these blueprints and pass them down generation after generation with incredible accuracy.
It's wild when you think about it. Something we can barely even see under a microscope, and it's got the instructions for a whole living being. Still feels like sci-fi to me.
It really is remarkable. And this whole process, this incredible feat of information storage and transfer, it all comes down to two main events: mitosis and meiosis. You might remember those from biology class.
Okay, cell division, mitosis, that's how our bodies like grow and repair themselves, right?
Exactly. Think of mitosis as life's super efficient copying mechanism. One cell becomes two, then four, and so on. And each new cell gets a brand new copy of those chromosomes from the original.
Like each cell has its own little Xerox machine, making sure those instructions are duplicated every single time.
A perfect analogy. Then there's meiosis, which is crucial for sexual reproduction. That's how we get sperm and egg cells. And each of those only carries half a set of chromosomes.
Right, right. So when they combine, you get a whole new mix of genetic information, a unique individual. It's like shuffling two decks of cards together, you get a whole new hand.
Exactly. But here's where Schrödinger hits a snag, what he calls a remarkable puzzle. You see, these chromosomes are passed down through who knows how many generations, exposed to all sorts of things, heat, radiation, you name it. And yet the essential instructions, they remain remarkably stable. How's that even possible?
It really is mind-boggling when you think about it. It's like whispering a secret to someone and then they whisper it to someone else and so on. And somehow, after hundreds of years, the secret's still intact. How can something like that happen at the molecular level?
It's a great question, and is what drove Schrödinger to really dig into this idea of mutations. See, back then, these sudden changes in traits, they were thought to be gradual, like Darwin's idea of evolution. But these mutations, they were different. They were more like sudden jumps, abrupt, discontinuous changes in those hereditary instructions.
So not a slow shift, but more like a sudden leap. Like one day you've got a bunch of brown beetles and then bam, out of nowhere there's a bright green one.
Well, maybe not quite that dramatic, but you get the idea. These changes, they happen suddenly, not gradually, kind of like, well, the quantum jumps you see in the energy levels of atoms.
Okay, I see where you're going with this, but hold on. If these genes are so prone to sudden changes, how can they also be stable enough to, pass down traits across generations with such incredible accuracy? It seems like we're back to square one.
That's a good point. It does seem paradoxical. And this is where Schrödinger, drawing on the work of physicist Max Delbruck, introduces a really cool concept. He proposes that a gene is kind of a periodic crystal.
An aperiodic crystal. Okay, now you're just using big words to make me feel like I should have paid more attention in chemistry class. Aperiodic crystal.
It sounds kind of like something out of like a science fiction movie, right?
Yeah.
But you're going to have to break it down for me. What is an aperiodic crystal, and how does it explain how genes work?
Okay, so imagine a regular crystal, like, say, a diamond.
Sparkly, beautiful, super strong.
Exactly. And that strength comes from how its atoms are arranged, this really simple repeating pattern.
Okay, got it. Diamonds. Simple patterns. But genes are more complex than diamonds, right?
Way more complex. Now imagine a crystal, but instead of that simple repeating pattern, the atoms are arranged in a specific order. But it's not repeating, it's like unique. That's an aperiodic crystal.
Okay, so like way more intricate, more like a snowflake than a diamond. Every snowflake is unique.
Perfect analogy. And that's what Delbruck thought genes were like, these big complex molecules with this kind of unique aperiodic structure. Okay, so how does this aperiodic crystal idea actually explain how genes can be both stable and, like, susceptible to mutations?
Well, think of it this way. The exact way those atoms are arranged in that aperiodic crystal, that's what gives the gene its specific properties. Just like the order of letters in a word gives it meaning.
So if you scramble the letters, you get a different word, a different meaning.
Right. And these different arrangements, chemists call them isomers, and that's basically what a mutation is.
Yes.
A new isomer of the gene, created when those atoms get rearranged.
So it's like a mutation is like scrambling the letters of a word to get a new word, a new set of instructions.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Rearranging those atoms, causing a mutation, it takes energy. Like there's a kind of barrier you have to overcome.
So it's not just happening randomly all the time. There's a kind of protection in place.
Yeah, exactly. And remember those X-ray experiments we talked about? They kind of back this up. Those experiments showed that a single, like really localized event, something like an ionization from the X-rays hitting the gene, could cause a mutation.
Right, like a tiny little burst of energy hitting the gene in just the right spot to scramble those atoms.
Exactly. That tiny burst, it's enough to overcome that barrier, rearrange those atoms, boom, you've got a mutation.
Okay, so this is all starting to make sense, but I gotta ask, doesn't this whole idea of life creating order, building these complex structures, doesn't it kind of go against one of the fundamental laws of physics, the second law of thermodynamics? You know, the whole entropy always increases thing.
Ah, yeah, the entropy paradox. That's where things get really wild.
Yeah.
Like you said, the second law basically says that entropy, which is a measure of disorder, always increases in isolated systems. The universe loves chaos.
Right. But life's like the opposite of chaos. It's organized, it's complex. It's like, imagine a perfectly organized desk in a room where everything else always goes towards like total mess.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what blew Schrödinger's mind. If everything tends towards disorder, how can life not just exist, but flourish? His answer was pretty radical. Life feeds on negative entropy.
Negative entropy. So, like, the opposite of disorder. Like, life is somehow reversing entropy.
Not reversing it, more like borrowing it. Schrödinger's idea was that life keeps its internal order by taking advantage of the order that already exists around it.
So instead of breaking the second law, life found a loophole.
Exactly. Think about it. We eat food, which is made of complex molecules, right?
Yeah.
We take that order, and we use it to maintain our own internal order.
And plants do something similar with sunlight. They're taking in energy from the sun and using it to create order, right?
Right. So life isn't defying the second law. It's more like it's playing a different game with the same rules. Schrödinger called this order from order. It's this incredible process, totally different from anything we see in the non-living world.
So instead of just letting entropy win, life figured out a way to, like, use it to its advantage. That's wild.
It really is. And here's the kicker. Schrödinger thought that this whole order from order thing, it might be connected to quantum mechanics, the theory that describes how those tiny atoms behave.
So not only is life this amazing biological phenomenon, it could hold the keys to understanding some of the most fundamental laws of physics. That's just, wow.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. Schrödinger, he wasn't afraid to ask the big questions, even if they seemed impossible. And in doing that, he opened up all these new ways of thinking about science. He may have left us with more questions than answers, but that's what makes his work so thought-provoking, right?
It definitely makes you think. We started with a seemingly simple question: what is life? And here we are talking about entropy, quantum mechanics, the whole universe.
It's quite a journey. And speaking of journeys, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive into Erwin Schrödinger's What is Life?
But hey, to our listeners, keep those big questions coming. Keep exploring, keep asking why, and never be afraid to dive deep into the mysteries of life, the universe, and everything.